In the 1980s, a group of researchers made a shocking discovery when they were doing surface prospection in the Rhineland-Palatinate in Germany, near a site for a new commercial development. Now, this spot is in the southern part of Germany and has a really rich past. And this whole region of Europe as a whole has a very long history. And what they ended up uncovering was hinting at that. They found a Neolithic settlement that seems to have been in use between 5,300 to 4,950 BCE. And it ended up being identified as part of the Linear Pottery Culture, or the LBK, which is a people group that we've covered here on this channel several times. They were fascinating, and some of Europe's first farmers. They spread out and held a wide territory across the continent for a very long time, before eventually sort of disintegrating and fracturing off into different smaller cultural groups. But before they did, they left us some amazing pottery and culture, and the first half of their history is kind of marked by its peacefulness. Unfortunately, as we have discussed before, the later part of their history, well, like I said, they ended up kind of splintering off into different groups, and the later part of the LBK timeline is marked by sites that show huge evidence of violence. There doesn't seem to have been one big thing that caused their culture to collapse. It was more a decline over several centuries that does unfortunately seem to have spiraled down into bloodshed at several sites. And at our site that they had discovered in Germany, well, that end date of 4,950 BCE, that's roughly in keeping with around that time of disintegration and fracture for the LBK as a whole. And this new site, which they would name Herxheim after a nearby modern community, it would also bear testament to this late-stage LBK violence, but to a completely unseen level for anywhere in ancient Europe. You see, around the ancient Herxheim, or for at least part way around it, there was a ditch. But this ditch would end up proving to be actually a series of ovoid pits that had been dug in and then refilled and then used again over the course of several centuries. In one of these pits, they would find the remains of over 450 people. And I say over 450 people because, frankly, even though the site was discovered in the 1980s, it still hasn't been fully excavated. And recent evidence points to the fact that there's probably a lot more people, dead people, in this pit. Some estimates go as high as 1,350. And what was most shocking about this is that almost all of these remains showed signs of incredible, horrible trauma. A majority of the remains showed signs of literal butchery, cut marks on the bones, and evidence of defleshing, very similar that we see too with the remains from animal processing. There was clear evidence of roasting, and long bones had been smashed to extract the marrow. And also at one point in the pits, a collection of skull cups was discovered, carefully put together in a little group on its own. But the rest of the bones were just kind of hucked. They were just kind of hucked in there with seemingly no regard for funerary practice. There were also animal bones found in this pit. And there was a large amount of pottery shards, some of it very fine, some of it coming from places very far away. Now, before we go any further, I want to stop and say you heard me talk about there not being signs of funerary practice here. Well, I know everyone does different funerary things, and we'll get to that in a second. But I want to stop and point out that we know how LBK graves normally look, and it's not this. And not only that, but there were some standard LBK burials found at Herxheim. Just unfortunately a very small amount compared to the ones in the pit. And once they started scientifically analyzing these bone fragments, the mystery only grew. Although in some ways, it also gave some understanding. Scientific analysis showed that the people in that pit did not come from Herxheim. Further, it was found that, though, like I said, the site as a whole was active for a while, people were living there for a while, this whole big, gory deposit only seems to have occurred in the very, very late stages of the settlement's history, like in the last 50 years or less. And now, after analyzing all this and looking at the remains, in 2015, two of the researchers from the site published a book where they put forth the theory that we are seeing the remains of exocannibalism at Herxheim. Exocannibalism specifically being cannibalism against people outside of your own people group, but in a way that's okay within your own culture or society. The most common example you'll hear given is cannibalizing your battlefield enemies. But I want to make it clear too, exocannibalism also points to, say, the cannibalism of enslaved peoples. You know what I mean? It's about eating people that are not considered the same as you, but in a way that's okay within your own culture. Now, because of how contentious a topic cannibalism has historically been, A, this led to a huge amount of news articles talking about mass cannibalism at Herxheim, and B, oh my goodness, some people really didn't like that. Perhaps the most prominent of these was this lady here named Andrea Z. Blantz. She's one of the state archaeologists for this area of Germany, and she has been very, very vocal, putting out several papers talking about the fact that she thinks that no, this is not an episode of exocannibalism or cannibalism at all, or at the very least there's not enough evidence to put that forward as a theory. She points to the skull cups being found and the smashed pottery as signs of what she calls, quote, ritual elements, but she never makes it clear why those would exclude cannibalism. She thinks it's likely it's a form of secondary burial. And I've seen a couple others echo this sentiment, in particular these two researchers here. But after reviewing their work, honestly, it just seems like kind of a shorter version of what Andrea said. Like they're just basically rehashing her theories in a different way. So let's address that. Let's address these claims, or rather the idea that there's not enough here to reasonably infer exocannibalism. And I will say, guys, I didn't come into this thinking I had to prove that Herxheim was cannibalistic. I didn't come in saying, well, yay, I get to talk about Herxheim and how much they ate people there. You know what I mean? Like, I was planning to do an episode on this topic, exocannibalism, eventually. It didn't have to be about Herxheim. And frankly, we're not just going to be talking about Herxheim, but I'll get to that. And I sat down and I did. I read the information that she's published in English promoting her theories. And frankly, she's published a lot. She's even made freely available a 69-page essay that was originally part of a larger book, writing about her theories on all this. And frankly, it feels very much like a response to that book I mentioned to you. She doesn't claim that it is, but my goodness, she cites it constantly. And she really seems to be trying to push the idea that there's not enough evidence here to infer exocannibalism. But like I said, a lot of it seems to rely on that faulty sort of ritual elements negate exocannibalism thinking. And her arguments against it aren't that convincing. And in fact, I can kind of boil them down into 3 sentences. 1, it would have been really, really difficult for them to do all this to all these people. 2, we have not found human poop with human proteins in it. So that means there's no way of knowing. And 3, there was way too many dead people for the population of Herxheim to have actually eaten. Herxheim was not that big a settlement. So that would be really, really wasteful if they were trying to eat all those people. Can you tell from my tone of voice how stupid I think all of those arguments are? For starters, some of the people in that pit came from around 300 kilometers away. And her best substitute for the cannibalism theory is a ritualized secondary burial. So by her definition, these ancient Neolithic people would have had to cross 300 kilometers of countryside with a rotting body by foot, and probably not in winter because it would have been too dangerous. So in summer, with animals everywhere, 300 kilometers to this place. That's not also very difficult? And further, if it's secondary burial and this Herxheim place was a place where everyone just came to do that, then why did they find regular LBK burials at the site? As for the human proteins in the human poop argument, well, I'll get back to that in a second. The third, though, of it being really wasteful, that actually kind of made me, she doesn't phrase it that way, but she's just like, who would have eaten all this stuff? And I had to get up and take a walk at that point, guys, to be honest, because no, when have in human history we ever been wasteful with food? Yeah. Also, in the interest of pure honesty, and I hate what I'm about to say, I have never read a professionally written document where the word ritual was doing so much heavy lifting. Like, I don't think this word means what she thinks it means. And that's already kind of a trope. Like, we already know there's some people in the historical community that will overuse the word ritual. No, I cannot make it clear how much this woman is relying on this word. In this 69-page document, she uses the word ritual 231 times. 231 times! Okay, just for context, just for some perspective, in this essay that's all talking about the bones from Herxheim and the bones that they're analyzing from Herxheim and these human bone fragments that they found, she uses the word bones only 83 times. Like, I can't make this up. This is one of the few things that I actually had to get up, and I meant it. I had to take a walk. I had to take a walk around because she made me so frustrated just trying to get at what she was saying. So in my opinion, Herxheim is, yes, a very, very good example of exocannibalism, or at least as far as we can tell.
It is certainly the most reasonable theory I've seen put forward.
But all of this made me realize that this topic was even more contentious than I actually thought it was. Like, wading into just trying to figure out this about Herxheim led to me researching all this other stuff about cannibalism as a whole and exocannibalism. Now, before we go any further, please let me make it clear that I am aware, and I've talked about actually on this channel before, of things like the Spanish colonization and their use and weaponization of accusations of cannibalism. Cannibalism has, through a couple of different times in human history actually, not just during Spanish colonization, it's been used as a weapon to justify enslaving and harming millions of people. And I think that's why people like this woman are sometimes very, very, very overcautious about diagnosing probable cannibalism at archaeological sites. And so on one hand, I want to say I completely understand that.
Or at least as much as I'm able as someone who hasn't had cannibalism, or specifically exocannibalism, used against me.
But on the other, I think, as you guys already are starting to see, and why I have to spend so long on the intro this time, is that the answer is not to avoid all evidence of cannibalism. And we have now seen this kind of need to fix reaction,
even outside of Herxheim, go to its most extreme point.
In the 1970s, an anthropologist published a book all about how he thinks that cannibalism has never existed in human history, and it's all lies or misunderstandings. And you can even still find stuff like that now, people talking about, nope, there's no evidence that cannibalism has ever been accepted widespread in any culture, and it's all just either bigotry or confusion or nonsense. And it's sort of like that's being held up to the old viewpoint of cannibalism around every corner, you know what I mean? Like, it's like they're trying to make up for it by going really, really hard in the other direction. But I'm going to be honest with you. Well, no, cannibals have not existed around every corner of human history. Yes, there have been many cultures in our past that have been okay with cannibalism in some form, whether that's funerary cannibalism or medicinal cannibalism or exocannibalism. And frankly, a lot of these sort of anti-cannibal theories smack with as much Western imperialism as the Cannibal King's viewpoint does. Like, let's go back to Andrea's idea that we need the human protein in human poop to ever diagnose cannibalism as happening for certain. Well, really? What about outside of Herxheim? What about when people from different cultures say, yeah, we've practiced cannibalism throughout our history. It's not a big deal for us. Thank goodness she's here to explain to them that they're wrong about their own history.
And now, unless you have some poop to give her, just get the hell out.
And I've seen this go to the huge extreme, and I was just complaining about this on Instagram the other day, where one writer in a news article put, quote, "Ultimately, the lesson of history is that cannibalism became a compelling justification used by Western imperialists to explain the enslavement of millions." End quote. Well, part of that is true, yes. It was partly used by Western imperialists to justify the enslavement of millions. Yes, that is partly true. But really? The ultimate lesson of all of human history, everywhere, was just about teaching Western people life lessons. Really?
And thankfully, things are starting to change a little bit, but guys, that article was just written 2 years ago. But at least academically.
More and more researchers and scientists are becoming aware and just acknowledging that, well, cannibalism, no, it's not everywhere. It has basically existed everywhere at some point. All respective inhabited continents have had exocannibals. So now you've heard some of the evidence from Herxheim.
But clearly, in this kind of fraught environment, if we're going to make sense of what we've seen,
we need to look beyond Herxheim. And I think we need to explore our history with cannibalism as a whole. And we're going to focus today just on exocannibalism. Now, that's not me trying to say it's more prevalent than the other forms that I mentioned to you. And actually, in the future, I will be doing episodes on each one of those. But because they're each so different in terms of human motivation, I don't want to just lump them all together.
But I'm not going to lie to you guys, even with just narrowing our focus to exocannibalism, we still have a ton of history to cover. So this is actually going to be my first ever 2-part Lost Realms episode. In this episode, part 1, we are going to cover the history of exocannibalism up until early modern history. So literally starting 1.45 million years ago, all the way up until the year 1500 AD. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, I'm not going to be able to cover every single instance of exocannibalism through all those years, but I've put together a series of stories from all throughout that time that I think could shed some light on Herxheim and the topic as a whole. We're going to dive into the deepest, darkest, oldest corners of our past together and take a huge, long trip into our history, our exocannibalistic history together.
So in this episode, guys, we are going to go farther than we've ever gone before.
Across a huge amount of different cultural backgrounds.
And like I said, every continent. I don't want anyone to feel like they're being picked on. Throughout our journey, especially because we're dealing with exocannibalism specifically, at times it's going to test our ability to view all of these peoples as we would view each other today. We're going to be interacting with cultures from our past that have a very different outlook on treating their fellow human than most of us do now. But one thing I really want to make clear before we go in is that we can be disgusted or upset or horrified over a culture's one practice and still love and respect and admire them as people for every single other part of their culture. Saying that a people group has committed cannibalism in the past does not mean that they deserve to be treated as anything less than awesome human beings today. And frankly, if we go in with a mindset of cannibalism equals savage and bad,
then we are just going to end up missing everything that's going on.
Because any of these cultures that engaged in this practice, it wasn't evil and bad and savage for them. So I've put together a little bit of a journey for us today, and because it's so much longer than our normal trips together, I have a couple tools I'd like to give you, a few gifts at the start. Well, the first is the border you see around me, but I tend to think of it as our walls. When you're in here with me, it's just you and me, and sometimes throughout our story, I will touch in with you like this, so that we can chat and so that I can share with you examples that maybe don't fit in our story and timeline, or that maybe aren't specifically exocannibalism, but that I think could be helpful for context or understanding. The second thing are these dashes here. I know they're just some dashes on the screen now, but since we're going to be traveling so much and going so many different places, if you ever miss hearing me say where we are, or you just need a refresher, the time and place will always be up here for you. The last thing that I have to give you before we set out is this. This is a bits box. You'll see these pop up from time to time, once in a while, and they'll contain information for you that's not really necessary to understand what we're talking about, but if you're one of those people that likes to squeeze as much info out of me as possible, well, these are for you. If you're the kind of person that puts these videos on and walks away and you miss one, please don't stress. If there's anything you really need to know to understand what we're covering today, I will say it out loud. Like I said, these are just for the people that want as much information as possible, and I hope that you enjoy them. So now, with our tool bag ready and our plan before us, well, let me say hello. It's lovely to see you. My name is Marie. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Lost Realms. evidence that points to cannibalism that's ever been found comes from the Turkana region of Kenya, found on a bone fragment dating to 1.45 million years ago. Now, because of the age of this find, it's impossible to know for sure if cannibalism actually was occurring here, but this ancient shin bone that you're looking at right now, which belonged to an ancient hominin species which is still up for debate, clearly displays repetitive cut marks done deliberately and also exactly where the calf muscle joins to the bone, pointing to evidence of defleshing. But again, with this going so far back into our past, it's hard to know for sure. It's worth noting here, though, that over 1,500 species of different animals do practice cannibalism. And if we go back to our fellow hominins, we can see that, well, it's not just that one-off incident in ancient Kenya. In fact, in more recent years, evidence points to early hominins eating each other across a wide range throughout history. The earliest known concrete evidence of cannibalism comes from Spain around 800 to 900,000 years ago at a cave known as Grandalina. The bones of 7 different individuals, members of an ancient hominin species known as Homo antecessor, display distinctive signs that they were eaten. Human teeth marks are on the bones, cut marks in those special flesh muscle removing spots, just like we see at Herxheim, can be noticed here. Further, it must be said that all these bones were mixed with animal remains that were treated exactly the same way. All of these remains were just lumped together. What is really unique and striking about the find at Grandalina is that we know from pollen analysis and other studies done that they were living in a temperate and high food availability time. Like I said, there were lots of animal bones found in that cave. They didn't seem to be going through any sort of food scarcity. And honestly, I don't mean to sound crass about it, but in a way, them attacking and eating their fellow hominins will kind of make sense. Researcher James Cole, in his groundbreaking and hilariously titled study called Assessing the Caloric Significance of Episodes of Human Cannibalism in the Paleolithic, he literally took the time to break down and find out how much calories a person would get from eating another person. And I don't mean to be casual about any pain that these ancient hominins may have gone through, but just to be clear, this is important. And they also looked at, too, at what some of the calorie intake would be for some of the game available to the ancient hominins at this time. They would have had access to rhinos, to horses, to deer, and they literally broke down the caloric gain they would get from hunting these animals versus the amount of energy it would take to catch these animals. And to put it bluntly, eating their fellow hominins would have been the most calories for the least effort. As Jesus Rodriguez, another researcher working on a similar study, put it very bluntly, quote, "Our analysis shows that Homo antecessor, like any predator, selected its prey following the principle of optimizing the cost-benefit balance." Unquote. And it's not just Homo antecessor that displayed this behavior. Evidence has been found of Neanderthal cannibalism at several places, but perhaps most strikingly at the cave of Moula Guarci in France. Now, they lived in this cave around 100,000 years ago, and excavations that have been going on there since 1991 have revealed a lot of evidence showing parts of at least 6 Neanderthals that appear to have been butchered and eaten, showing the exact same telltale features that I've described to you at several other sites now. And once again, we see here plenty of evidence that they were not under food scarcity. The hominin remains are once again mixed with animal remains, and pollen analysis and other studies of the area show that they were living in a time with lots of other food sources available. But for some reason, they chose to do this. Now, I want to make it clear, prehistoric cannibalism is not limited at all to exocannibalism, and there's many different instances from this time period of what appears to be survival cannibalism, or even funerary cannibalism, such as with the Magdalenian culture, which was also found in Europe. But again, we're just focusing on exocannibalism for the purpose of this episode. And I hope the point I'm starting to make clear is that there is good evidence that people were eating people, not just for starvation, not just as part of a funerary practice. And frankly, evidence of people eating people has also been found in prehistoric China and more recent ones in Africa as well, not just that 1.45 million year old fossilized shin bone from Kenya. I'm merely focusing on the European stories here because frankly that's where the most information available in English on this topic is. People are complicated, There could be instances that I just described to you that were a combination of factors. Maybe a group of Neanderthals faced a really bad winter, and they still weren't okay with killing each other, but they were fine with attacking and killing another Neanderthal group that may have been nearby. And in fact, there'll be several other instances we get into here that show that sometimes our different cannibal categories can overlap a little bit. In fact, some studies have suggested that ancient cannibalism was so common that we've evolved resistances to some of the threats that could pose to us. Prion diseases are diseases caused by mutated proteins, not germs or viruses or anything like that. The most famous of which is probably mad cow disease. And the way that you catch mad cow disease or any prion disease is by eating infected flesh. So flesh that already has these mutated proteins in it. The first human-based known prion disease was identified amongst the people of Papua New Guinea, specifically among a people group known as the Four, where they developed one known as Kuru. Now, I want to make it clear that the people suffering from this disease were not exocannibals. They were practicing funerary cannibalism. It was thought to be disrespectful to allow maggots and other insects to eat the bodies of loved ones. So after death, the women of the community would prepare the bodies and consume them as an act of love and devotion. Children were also allowed to partake in this eating, but it was thought to be unclean for men to do so. So that is why specifically it was only women and children that did this. It was part of their service to their family and their community. But unfortunately, it eventually led to this disease, Kuru. Now, Kuru, like all prion diseases, has a really long incubation period. So even if you're unlucky enough to eat infected flesh, it will be a really long time normally before symptoms start to develop. Which is why when the women and children of this community started dying horribly, in horrible, horrible, painful ways, no one tied it to the funerary cannibalism at first. No one knew what was going on, and the men of the community were desperately trying to save their women and children. They knew they were on the brink of destruction. Like, that's how bad it got. There were some villages where there were almost no women left. The reason I'm sharing all this with you, even though it obviously didn't take place in prehistory, is that obviously prion diseases don't play favorites. And recent research has shown that many humans today have natural genetic safeguards in place to prevent them from developing these prion diseases. But the only way we would have evolved that is if we were exposed to eating contaminated flesh in the past. Meaning that a lot of researchers now feel that cannibalism must have been somewhat prevalent in prehistory, or we wouldn't have evolved these protective genes in the first place. Now again, with the time separating us, it's hard to tell sometimes when it may have been funerary cannibalism, or survival cannibalism, or exocannibalism. But as you've seen, there is good evidence for at least some of it being exocannibalism. And we literally have the legacy of these ancient cannibalistic acts still in our bodies today. But let's come back for a second, because I think it might be helpful at this point, before we dive into ancient history, where we're going to see a lot more maybe relatable faces, to stop and look at some of the cannibalism practiced by our closest living relatives. It can be hard when we think of chimpanzees. I know if you're like me, I very much love animals, especially chimps. I think they're adorable. I think they're wonderful. I think they belong in the wild and don't make good pets, and I think that it's stupid when people try to keep them as pets. But I absolutely love them, and they are so smart, and they're so adorable sometimes. But they're also incredibly, incredibly violent. Now, this violence doesn't take away from their innately awesome qualities, but they can be extremely violent. And they've been noticed both in captivity and in the wild to participate in cannibalism. A chimpanzee can be affectionate and smart and loyal, and also hunt and consume infants. Some have even made the argument that female chimps, which are known to sometimes leave the group when they give birth, do that to protect their baby from being cannibalized as soon as it's born, because frankly, that has happened. In 2014, researchers in the Mahale Mountains in Tanzania watched a mother choose to give birth to her infant in front of about 20 other chimps that she was living in the wild with, and watched as one of the adult males walked over, snatched the baby, killed and ate it, for seemingly no reason, other than it was something new in his group that he didn't know. Even Jane Goodall, during the infamous Gombe War of the Chimps in the 1970s, witnessed a high-ranking female chimpanzee and her daughter go around and grab infants from lesser-ranked females in their own group and eat them. But again, they didn't seem to be under any food stress. It seems to have mostly been an issue of competitiveness, that, these new young chimps didn't pose a threat to her and her status. It has been argued that humans encroaching on chimp territory may have exacerbated this behavior, but frankly, it doesn't seem like we created it. And it can be so hard to balance this picture of chimpanzees with this picture of chimpanzees. Likewise, as we go forward, I think it's going to be hard for us to balance, the beautiful aspects that we know of ancient history and how wonderful their cultures were, with some of the darker things I'm going to be sharing with you.
But we can also see that there's beautiful things about all these cultures that we're discussing.
As awful and painful as it can be to hear about stuff like this, we need to pay attention to these things and try to understand them if we're going to understand our history in relation to this topic as best as we can. Now things start to get a little more interesting, because now we get to the part of our history collectively where we start to get written accounts of cannibalism, or stories of it in some cases. The oldest known written reference to cannibalism at all occurs in the pyramid texts, which are the oldest known body of literature from ancient Egyptian religious customs. Now, these texts get their name because they weren't written on papyrus. They were carved on the walls of the insides of several pyramids, and the pyramid text as a whole can be read across a couple of different locations, at least in different forms. But one of the most interesting part of the pyramid text to us is a hymn that appeared in the pyramid texts of King Unas, who ruled at the end of the 5th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, at the time when Egypt was still sort of in its golden age of pyramid building. Now, what I'm about to read to you is part of a much, much longer hymn, and dedicated to helping King Unas pass on to the afterlife, and also sort of glorifying him. Quote, "Unas is the bull of the sky, aggressive in his heart, living on the being of every god, eating entrails of them who came with their bellies, full of magic from the Isle of Flame. Unas is the one who eats men and lives on gods, a lord of messengers who dispatches orders. It is grasper of top-knots who is in cauldron, who lassos them for Unas. It is the serpent with raised head who guards them for him and restrains them for him. It is the one who is over the reddening, who binds them for him. It is Khans who cuts the lords. He strangles them for Unas. He extracts for him what is in their bodies. It is the messenger whom Unas sends to confront. It is Shesmu who cuts them up for Unas, who cooks for him the things which are in them on his evening hearthstones. It is Unas who eats their magic, who swallows their ox." End quote. And oh my goodness, okay, first we have to note, 1, how incredibly descriptive and absolutely metal that was, and 2, the heavy symbolism that we're hearing in this language, which you can hear too, like the different sort of deity names there, like Shesmu, and the repeated references to the gods and magic and things like that. I want to make it clear too that absolutely no modern Egyptologist thinks at all that widespread cannibalism was practiced at this point in ancient Egypt, and that's not what I'm trying to suggest. Instead, we can see here, though, the idea of cannibalizing his enemies as being a sign of his dominance over them and a sign of his dominion over the evil forces of the spirit. But I do think it's important to note, because not only, like I said, is it the earliest written reference to cannibalism at all, but it also proves specifically exocannibalism versus survival cannibalism existing already as a concept. This isn't Unas eating them because he needs to survive. He's devouring the enemies. He's devouring the gods' magic. This is about power and authority and kind of prestige. And we can see here too that maybe at this point in time, in the right context like this, in this framework, exocannibalism would not necessarily have to be viewed as a negative thing. And jumping around a little bit now in both our time period and where we are in the ancient world, let's visit Asia for the first time. When not long after King Unas, we would see the rise of one of the earliest and greatest civilizations in ancient China, the Shang dynasty. While different scholars still debate exactly when they were in power, the most recent studies seem to show that the Shang ruled from 1600 BCE
to 1046 BCE. And while we know stories of another dynasty called the Xia that may have existed before them, the Shang is the first people in all of China to leave us written records, perhaps most famously in the oracle bones. They also spread out and held a wide territory, and theirs was a fascinating ancient culture just in general that produced beautiful art and architecture. However, they also practiced human sacrifice and animal sacrifice on an absolutely massive scale, almost to a level unseen anywhere else in the ancient world. Now, slavery did exist amongst these people at this time, and there were also different types of slaves, household personal slaves and field workers. And also in this way, there were different types of human sacrifice, because it was mostly enslaved people being sacrificed here. At times, it was sort of a ritualized suicide sacrifice. So if a noble died, his personal slaves were expected to kill themselves and follow him into the afterlife still. But the Shang were also famous for, in times of great stress or famine or political unrest, sacrificing huge amounts of people, and these were normally captives taken in battle. Modern analysis has shown that after the Shang would capture enemy peoples, they would bring them back to their cities and keep them prisoner for some time until they were needed for sacrifice. During their incarceration, there's evidence that they weren't treated well. Their diet doesn't seem to have been particularly healthy. They weren't being fed right. And it's hard to describe just how massive some of these sacrifices were. For example, to end a famine that was believed to be brought on by the god's wrath, a Shang king known as Wu Ding sacrificed over 9,000 people at once in offerings to the god. Human sacrifice does not always equal human cannibalism, but in a fascinating study only released in 2023, Dmitry Kulikov, after analyzing oracle bone and other inscriptions from this time, claims to have found many references to human cannibalism, specifically exocannibalism, mentioning different methods of preparation, and these usually seem to be involved in sacrifice in terms of spiritual sacrifices, in times of crisis or for other purpose, some seeming to be mostly designed to give power to a leader or king of the time. This is all still controversial and being heavily debated, but it's worth noting that information about cannibalism from ancient Chinese history in general, I hate to say this to an extent, the Chinese government has been accused in recent years of covering up instances like this, possibly in relation to more recent instances of exocannibalism that have happened in Chinese history that we're going to touch on later. But I still wanted to include all this with the Shang here because it is interesting, and there is some evidence growing that looks like this may have been a thing. Leaving Asia now and checking in with the rest of the world. If we look out a little bit, we start to see written accounts or stories or sometimes accusations of cannibalism from other cultures too. Famously in Homer's The Odyssey, which is believed to have been composed between 800 and 750 BCE, we hear the story of a tribe of giant cannibals living on an island who pelted the hero Odysseus' ships with rocks, sinking all of them except the title characters, hopefully. And the famed Greek historian Herodotus, writing in his book The Histories, wrote of a people known simply to him as the man-eaters that lived at the literal edge of the known world, claiming beyond them was only a land of true desolation where no one could live. And of course there was the famous Kynocephali, these dog-headed people that the ancient Greeks, Romans, and Arabs would report living in different places, mostly in India and Africa. People that they described as literally having the bodies of humans and the heads of dogs that would feast on the flesh of both their own species and that of others. And to be honest, a lot of historians in more modern times have looked at stories like Herodotus and others that would later emerge from the Greeks and Romans of like the foreign people eating and devouring flesh, and it's sort of old-timey ancient world propaganda. It was the Greco-Roman way of just kind of bad-mouthing their enemies. And to be honest, a lot of those dog-headed people stories do have very racist undertones. Some, it does seem like maybe it's the accounts of Greco-Roman explorers or traders coming across local hunter-gatherer tribes and just not having a lot of understanding there. But if we stand back and we put aside sort of the hymns and the stories, and we look at just the archaeological evidence, well, it has kind of a different viewpoint. Jumping back up to Europe for a second, to England in the Bronze Age, roughly 4,000 years ago, in what is today a place known as Charterhouse Warren, which is a cave system in the Mendip Hills, Somerset. Bones started being discovered there by cavers in the 1970s. Further investigation would reveal that the bodies of at least 37 people appeared to have been thrown down a 15-meter shaft in the cave,
by people who had killed, butchered, and eaten them. Now, after starting to analyze these bones, they found that amongst them there were men, women, and children. And in fact, over half the population down that shaft was made up of teenagers or younger. Now, these early Bronze Age British communities were usually only made up of between 50 to 100 people. So archaeologists working on the site have pointed out that you could think of this as literally wiping out a whole little community. Cut marks and scrapes on the bones indicated the attackers had systematically dismembered their victims using stone tools and then likely consumed them. However, they don't think the attackers did this out of hunger, as there was a large amount of animal bones dating to the same period, bearing these same signs of butchery found in the shaft with them. It was like they were just kind of chucked in there. There was no signs of resistance or fighting back. They were likely taken by surprise. And there's very limited evidence that this was due to any sort of tension, due to a fight over resources. There's no evidence of like drought or famine happening at that point. Professor Rick Schulting from Oxford University, who's been studying all this extensively, has said that he feels strongly that this massacre could have only been carried out by another, even bigger group of people. And he felt strongly that an act this dramatic and huge, especially again given the population numbers at the time, would have almost certainly had wide-ranging effects across this area that echoed for generations, in his words. He also says he thinks they may have been eaten as part of a ritual to dehumanize them, to send a message by insulting the remains. Speaking directly about the find, he said in a BBC interview, quote, "This was something exceptional. This level of almost erasing the person, literally chopping them into pieces, seems like something you would only do if fueled by anger, fear, and resentment. This is not a homicidal maniac. This is a community of people that came together to do this to another community." End quote. He feels strongly that this may be an act of retribution of one community against another for some wrong or crime that was felt to be done. Taking more from that same BBC interview now, quote, "If you felt wronged, it was ultimately your responsibility to do something about it. It's not like you could go to the magistrate and ask for something to be done. Things cycled out of control, and normal checks and balances failed. That could be because of one particularly antagonistic person who didn't let things rest, or had their own agenda. If you have those kind of people on two sides of a conflict, it starts to spiral out of control," he suggests. End quote. Now, all of this can start to sound very dramatic and almost like you're reading a thriller or something. However, he does go on to point out too, and I want to make it clear too, this doesn't seem to have been a widespread practice that happened all the time, or probably we would find more evidence of it. And actually, we do have a little more evidence of it, but I'll get to that. But the point is, we don't have a ton of evidence of it. And this should be maybe more viewed as an act in extreme circumstances, like he's suggesting. We don't know the background story here with these community groups at Charterhouse Warren. We don't know what's going on. We don't know the tea. I'm not trying to justify what happened to them in any way, and oh my goodness, rest in peace, my ancient friends. But I just mean there's a story there, clearly. So we can't take that as necessarily a widespread practice, but what we can see is that exocannibalism is clearly not an unknown practice either. I'm very much one of those people that thinks there's nothing new under the sun. If we're seeing it here at Charterhouse Warren, it must have happened at least at some other point before this. We can't assume this is the only time it's happened in British history. And frankly, we know it wasn't. The ancient Celts were long accused of human sacrifice, first by Julius Caesar, and then later by others, and there were some historically that also accused them of cannibalism. Now, in more recent times, it was thought for a while that was mostly propaganda. And it must be said, that is somewhat Julius Caesar style. He could do that. But recent archaeological evidence excavated at a Gloucestershire pit in the UK uncovered 40 ancient bodies dated to around 2,000 years ago, where they appear to have been sacrificed along with several dogs and cannibalized. They've already uncovered a femur that was split lengthways, which is actually really hard to do, and then evidence where the edges of it were scraped to get all the marrow out. As the lead archaeologist Mark Horton of Bristol University put it, quote, "We were very surprised to find this. You cannot do this by accident. Splitting the bone in this way is quite a delicate procedure, and the only reason you would want to extract the marrow is to eat it." End quote. And recent excavations as well near a boating lake at Eton College found further evidence of humans with butchery marks on them. Radiocarbon dating on the bones dated them between 30 BC to 130 AD, and one of the surviving skulls recovered pointed to a gruesome death that at least some of these people must have faced. From Horton again, quote, "The person was poleaxed from the back, and then the front of their head was also smashed completely. They were clubbed to death in a rather vicious way." We know from descriptions in Caesar's Gallic Wars that the Celts held mass sacrifices before big battles. They rounded up the criminals initially, then the lame and the sick. What's interesting about our bones is that quite a lot show evidence of lameness or disease, end quote. Now, where all these bodies were recovered there it was in a sinkhole. And if the sinkhole opened up, it could have been viewed as a portal by the ancient Celts to the underworld. And Horton thinks that these people may have been killed as a sacrifice and then eaten before a large battle as part of a ritual to the Celtic dog god of the underworld, hence explaining the dog remains there too. Research is still ongoing, and this is a very recent discovery, but it is fascinating, and it's starting to paint for us a clear picture of when exocannibalism, because again, we're talking about criminals, we're talking about the thought of as a burden to society. I don't say that they would have been, I'm not trying to be discriminatory, but in their mindset, we're talking about others again. People that it's okay to do this to because they're of no other value anymore. Not trying to justify it, just explain it. And while these exocannibalistic practices may not have been common, they were clearly not unheard of either. Same with the human sacrifice angle, just that. For a long time that was thought to be a myth or just propaganda, until bodies that were clearly sacrificed started being recovered from peat bogs. And we won't dive into too much on the human sacrifice topic here, but I do want to touch on it. And I also hope it shows back, looking at our old friend Herxheim where we started, how our ritual-loving friend there was talking about ritual and specifically spiritual acts, and her seeming to think if those are present, then for some reason Herxheim can't be exocannibalism. Like I said, that seems to be sort of where she gets hung up. But as you're seeing yourself here in ancient Europe, those two can go hand in hand. Killing people that are criminals or captives or old or lame or thought to be a burden. So they're no longer considered to be of worth anymore. But they can be useful in this way, as a sacrifice and to gain spiritual power through eating their flesh. And in fact, as we progress through history, we're going to see so clearly that it's enslaved peoples that are often the target of exocannibalism. Like I mentioned to you earlier, it could be captives from battle. It can be targeted ethnic minorities that are thought to be different than you. It can be criminals. And as we move from the ancient world into what I'm going to call our middle history, we're going to see more evidence of exocannibalism, and also, unfortunately, more evidence of people sort of on the margins getting hurt by it. Before we jump into this next period of history, though, let's stop for a second, because I have a more modern example of exocannibalism to share with you that I think could be kind of helpful. The term Dayak people is a modern one, kind of applying to roughly a group of hundreds of different indigenous cultures that live in the Borneo region of Indonesia. Now, these people had a centuries-long history of participating in headhunting and ritualized exocannibalism of their enemies. However, it must be understood it was only in this context that it would be considered appropriate. One doesn't go butcher one's brother and eat him. And I want to stop here and highlight the fact that they shouldn't just be known for their headhunting and cannibalistic historical practices. They have a rich history involving beautiful art and some really fascinating and also very beautiful tattoos. And guys, I really encourage you, if you get a chance, to learn more about the historical peoples and the current peoples indigenous to Borneo, because there's just so much fascinating stuff there. And headhunting in general as a practice would die out after a peace treaty was signed with the Dayak and some of their neighbors. Ritualized exocannibalism would also stop around this time too, which always had a larger spiritual connotation than just eating the flesh of an enemy. And it should also be known too that it wasn't always necessarily like roasting and eating flesh. Sometimes it was about drinking the blood of an enemy. In reference to this custom, one modern Dayak woman put it very bluntly, and I think in a very enlightening way, saying, quote, "This happened now. They drink the blood because that is the tradition. They must, because they will be very strong, stronger than before if they eat the blood, eat the hearts." End quote.
And we'll actually come back to the idea of that organ eating as well, as we'll see that reappear in several cultures across history. But I do want to make it clear that even in this context, as shocking as it may seem, there are set rules for what we're seeing, where there's a set thought process of when it's okay to do this and not okay. It's not like a savage free-for-all. I'm not trying to condone this behavior in any way, but it needs to be understood when these things have happened in the past that they don't just spontaneously occur in a vacuum. And I bring up them as an example here specifically because, well, unfortunately, in more recent times, these practices made an extremely gruesome resurgence. But again, it didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't sort of out of the blue. And it wasn't just with the Dyaks. You see, in the 1930s, the Dutch colonial government started bringing in migrant people, the Madurese, to live in the Bornean region and throughout Indonesia. The Dayak and several other cultures in the area over time started to develop tensions with these Madurese immigrants, these refugees, who were often accused of criminal behavior and outright violence by the Dayak. The Dayak made it clear eventually they felt they were under threat. And later on, throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, several major outbursts and massacres would occur against these local Madurese populations carried out by the Dayak and several other groups. Police eventually fled the scene oftentimes in these cases, and in all these instances the Madurese were absolutely slaughtered. Horrifically shocking violence and cannibalism occurred during this time against men, women, children, and babies. Between these multiple outbursts over the course of those few years, thousands and thousands of Madurese would be killed. And this being modern times, reporters swarmed on the scene, and news of this was broadcasted all over the world. The Dayak, each time who strongly claimed that they were acting in self-defense, had no problems reporting what they were doing to the reporters showing up in their home. Some young men even boasting of their acts. A young Dayak man even telling a reporter from The Independent, quote, "We caught one of them this afternoon, and we killed it, and we ate it, because we hate the Madurese," end quote. A local Dayak chief of the village of Montredo, speaking to The Independent as well, said that at least 70 Madurese had been killed and beheaded in his village alone. In his words, quote, "Some are shot first, some are stabbed to death. They don't care about women, children. They kill everyone, including babies. They chop their heads off, and they eat them," end quote. Now, this Chief Ubek did try to disarm the situation, even sheltering 2 Dayak families in his own home. But when confronted with his fellow villagers, he had to give them up or risk his own death. And I want to make it clear that these actions should not be viewed as representing every single Dayak person, past or present or future. Like I said, this was a long building situation in a strong cultural context where this was already historically viewed as okay in certain circumstances. That's not me trying to justify what they did either. This is a complicated situation, and I'm speaking as an outsider. I also want to make it clear, too, that the Dayak were not the only people group involved in this massacre. Though there are to this day Dayak there who claim they have done absolutely nothing wrong. This was an act of self-defense. Do you remember that quote I gave you from a modern Dayak woman about drinking the blood and the power it gave earlier in eating the heart? That was a woman who was talking to CNN proudly in 2001 about her cousin and his part in these massacres, killing some of these Madurese refugees and eating them, who she was proud of for taking part in this, proud of him for helping to get rid of the Madurese that she hated. He was only a senior in his high school at the time when the conflict broke out. She defended his actions, saying that the local Madurese had attacked several of the Dayak people. They had to do this to protect their community. All of this was so shocking to the rest of the world that different NGOs and anthropologists and things like that have put forward different theories that try to explain it and contextualize it, talking about the economics and religious differences. But to be blunt, if you listen to the people involved themselves, they make it very clear they're doing it because they don't like the Madurese there. They don't like their attitude. That same woman who I quoted from that we've been chatting about, Wee, when asked if she thought the Madurese should ever be allowed to come back and settle the area, she said, quote, "I don't think so. So many people don't like their behavior and their attitude, so of course we reject them," end quote. Now, before you go thinking too little of our friend Wee, be aware that before the massacre started, she was apparently trapped in her home for several days because Madurese locals were threatening to kill her. her perspective is also colored by what's going on around her, just like anybody else's would be. And I do want to say, it's easy for us to go, okay, self-defense. But no, the Dayak really did. They felt marginalized. That's not explaining it or justifying it, but it is. There's a lot of different feelings here. But regardless of the feelings involved, it clearly went to a whole new extreme in terms of retribution. Dozens of people were being killed every single day, sometimes with their hearts being cut out and eaten raw on the spot by their murderers, again, for spiritual power. And also to do what was described by some as, quote, get rid of the curse of the Madaris, end quote. So why am I telling you all of this very gruesome part of our more recent past? Well, for starters, I think it sort of shows the idea again that this sort of behavior didn't occur in a vacuum. As I said, it was like a buildup of this being an older cultural practice as a way of dealing with people that we don't agree with and we make war with. I'm not trying to justify their actions because there can't be any justification of killing and eating children and women who haven't hurt you in any single way. But the idea that cannibalism is a modern myth, I think, or something that was just recently invented. Like, these people didn't come up with all this on the spot, like you heard. This was part of a larger context. Which brings me to the second reason I choose to bring it up here, because remember our friends from ancient Somerset in Charterhouse Warren, from thousands and thousands of years ago in Bronze Age Britain. Remember what the archaeologists told us from there. One community against another community. What seems to be a literal wiping out of another group, perhaps due to some perceived slight. Though those are all educated guesses, I think that they're good ones when the archaeologists made them, and I can't help but think of the Dayak and the Madaris when I think of Charterhouse Warren. Even if we don't know the motivation there, I think it's safe to assume that the actions we saw at that place didn't spontaneously just snap into existence. Whether it was something that occurred every day or not, just like it didn't occur every day at any point with the Dayak, except at the height of all this, at the height of all this buildup of tension. But throughout their long history, it wouldn't be every day like that. It'd be in times of warfare, of conflict. And like I said, I'm not saying this is exactly what happened at Charterhouse Warren, but I just want to sort of give an example of a context that could be helpful to keep in mind. And of course, so much of what we saw at both places does just feel so much like what we saw at Herxheim. And I think both the stuff we've seen at Charterhouse Warren and in Borneo will be helpful as we travel through time to learn from. We haven't been to China since the Shang Dynasty. Let's go back to there for a second. Because now, after the Shang Dynasty, throughout our period, actually throughout the late BCEs and through the early CEs, we see evidence of both survival cannibalism, but more importantly to us, instances of cannibalism used for revenge, or as a type of scare tactic, or punishment. By this point, it seems to devolve in a need to humiliate and dominate these other people, these criminals in their eyes. During the reign of Emperor Wu Liang, who reigned from 464 to 549 CE, captured enemies or criminals could be sold at market for the purpose of being eaten. Specific types of punishment cannibalism appear around this time too. Quote, numerous prisoners of war were purchased and caged. Whenever there was a demand for meat, some of them were taken out, cut, broiled, and consumed. Similarly, those disloyal to the throne were severely punished by having their tongues cut off, sold, and cooked for consumption. End quote. By around 889, we hear accounts of different chieftains and warlords capturing the elderly and the young from enemy populations, and the meat not needed to feed themselves could be sold at market. It was a good way to raise money for one's armed forces, though there's differing accounts at this point as to how commonplace that was amongst the official military of the emperor. People from other cultures who visited China during this time would make note of it in their accounts, including Arab-Persian author Abu Zayd al-Sarafi, who put together a book of accounts of different Arab travelers who visited China towards the end of the late 9th century. He mentions that persons captured in war campaigns were often eaten, whether food scarcity was necessarily an issue at that point or not, noting, quote, "Cannibalism is permissible for them according to their legal code, for they trade in human flesh in their markets," end quote. However, maybe the most famous incidents of cannibalism, and specifically exocannibalism, from Asian history come from the Mongols, who in 1211 CE, under the reign of Genghis Khan, invaded China, striking both the Jin dynasty in the north of the country and, at a later point, the Song dynasty in the south. It would take a very long time, but eventually the grandson of Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, in 1271, would declare himself emperor of China, founding the Yuan dynasty. But this only really lasted until around 1368, at which point it started to fragment off. After the collapse of the dynasty, Tao Yongxing wrote down his recollections of the period. So these would be first-hand accounts that he would have known either from himself or those close to him, and they are harrowing. He criticizes the Mongol soldiers heavily, noting that, while yes, in the past people have been eaten for the need of survival, the Mongol soldiers who had occupied the northern regions, quote, "enjoyed eating human flesh," end quote, and goes into great detail in both their culinary practices with this, and also, unfortunately, again, how we see it's often the weakest or most undefended members of society that are getting targeted the worst. Quote, "Young children were the most appreciated, women came next, and men last. Some roasted whole in large jars whose outside touched the fire. Others were placed on an iron grate to be roasted alive. Sometimes the victim was put inside a double bag, which was put into a large pot in order to boil them alive." End quote. He later goes on to account that in times where there were lots of dead bodies around, the Mongols would even get picky, choosing to just cut off the breasts from women and the thighs from men. And now, as we leave Asia and go over to Europe and look at the European accounts of the Mongols, we start to see that even though I know some of these sort of horrific accounts of what the Mongols are doing sound almost cartoonish, the European accounts do match up really well with the Chinese ones. Christian writers at the time criticized the Mongols for their cannibalism, and specifically the sadistic nature it often seemed to take. They note what they describe as beautiful women and virgins being to death, at which point again sometimes only their breasts were cut off, which were kept for their leaders as delicacy. And Simon of St. Quentin, a Dominican friar who visited the Mongol court in 1245 CE as a member of a party sent there to try to establish peace, noted that their cannibalism was commonplace, and they seemed to have diverse reasons for doing so. And writing of their motivations for these practices, he notes, quote, "sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of pleasure, and sometimes in order to strike fear and terror in the people who will hear of it," end quote, seem to be the primary reasons that these acts were committed. And here, when speaking of the Mongols' culinary practices, I have to take a side note and step back and talk to you guys a little bit about that as a general thing among cannibals as a whole. Across several sources, you see mentioned that among many different cultures that practice these things, women seem to taste the best, or children, depending on who you ask. For the curious, hands, feet, breasts, and buttocks seem to be the favored parts of the body. And in places where things like this are practiced, whether for survival or for exocannibalism, we start to see certain lingo develop. In Fiji and the Bismarck archipelago, different words existed for different types of corpses, those of enemies or foreigners who it was okay to eat, or the corpses of family members and members of your community, people who mattered. It was considered a horrible insult to even make a joke about eating those type of people. There's a clear social hierarchy here, just like there has been at all the places we visited. Sticking around in Europe, we see throughout the Middle History period different claims of people eating hearts and livers, sometimes for just consumption and other times for medicinal purposes. Also in Europe during our Middle Period is the first time we come across what I think is a really good example of specifically medicinal exocannibalism, and that is the sale and consumption of mumia. Now, mumia was originally supposed to be a type of mineral pitch or bitumen. Due to some linguistic misunderstandings, the Arabic word for this pitchy substance, known as mumia, got transliterated into mumia, referring to the mummified remains of a person, usually an ancient Egyptian person. The mummified remains of these people would literally be ground up and consumed for what was thought to be numerous health benefits. This practice would last for centuries. There was also sometimes allegations of not using ancient Egyptian mummies and perhaps mummies from the bodies of criminals. But I think the important thing here to note is that while the average European during this period would have never thought it was appropriate to dry up and grind up and eat a family member, it was okay to do to ancient Egyptians or sometimes even criminals because they weren't the same type of people. And now I think we're ready to visit the Americas for the first time. At around 900 CE, in the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, specifically an area known as Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico, the incomplete remains of 8 people, both adults and subadult, were found, bearing the telltale signs of butchery that we've seen at other sites we've encountered, including cut marks pointing towards defleshing and evidence of roasting. There is also what's called pot polishing on the bones, which, though more controversial, does seem to point to the bones being immersed in liquid and were literally boiled in a pot, causing the ends of the bones to rub against the inside of the pot and it wore down smooth. There's also indications of hammerstones being used to extract marrow like we've heard of before. And while this triggered a debate at first and some tried to argue that maybe this was simply a secondary burial practice, very similar to how we heard at Herxheim at the start. In more recent years, human flesh proteins have been found in the remains of ancient human feces from this period, showing that yes, the human flesh was being consumed. The remains were discarded along with other animal remains, showing no favoritism amongst them. Traditionally, the ancient people who were believed to partake in this practice in this region were sometimes known as the Anasazi, but that name comes from another still existing culture known as the Navajo, that had to deal with these other ancient people as an enemy. And the term Anasazi is literally a play on Navajo words for enemy ancestors. The modern-day Pueblo people, who believe themselves to be the descendants of these ancestral people, therefore prefer the term today ancestral Puebloans to the Anasazi. But I've heard recently that this may not be true across the board, and I only bring this up here to allow you to decide which term you, the viewer, feel most appropriate. What is clear, though, is that these ancient people were practicing cannibalism, and given the context, it seems most likely exocannibalism, perhaps against the ancestors of the Navajo, perhaps against other peoples. And the evidence is not just found at this one small site in Chaco Canyon, but across multiple sites. But a lot of the remains found at these different sites may have coincided with a period of ancient drought, too. This may well have exacerbated things. However, most historians have noticed now, too, that this has happened across multiple sites and multiple generations. Many of the raids that seem to end in cannibalism seem to be just that, raids that also feature elements of trophy taking, hinting again at exocannibalism. And now that I think we've looked around the world a little bit and have a good idea what was going on during this period, I think we're almost ready to stop for today. But before we do, I have one more strange kind of story to share with you now, and one that I think will be a particularly good one to end on. The story of the First Crusades and the cannibalism therein. The First Crusade, which existed from 1096 to 1099 CE, was a spiritually based military campaign organized by Western Europeans to go and retake what was considered to be the holy city of Christendom, Jerusalem, from occupant Muslim control. This crusade actually functioned in 2 waves. There was the famous People's Crusade that went first and went absolutely horribly, and the second was called the Prince's Crusade, which left in the late summer of 1096, reaching Constantinople by November of the same year, before proceeding to travel through Asia Minor, being involved in several battles throughout that region, before eventually achieving their goal of capturing Jerusalem on the 15th of July in 1099. Now, it was on their way to Jerusalem at the city of Ma'ar during the capture of that place that we hear accounts of cannibalism by the Crusaders. And written accounts of these acts start flooding through Europe only a few years after the First Crusade ended. What's most interesting about all this is not just the cannibalism that may or may not have occurred itself, but how it was perceived and presented to the public. Some of the earliest 2 accounts, one written by Robert the Monk and the other by Baldric of Borgau, make it clear that cannibalism did occur, but it was for survival, driven by hunger, and was hidden and not something that was done boastfully or to try to intimidate the enemy necessarily. In both of the accounts by these 2 French monks, it's presented as this being a holy mission, and this is what was needed to do to fulfill that mission. Because they claimed it was done for survival, this was not viewed as an evil act. Robert the Monk, writing in around 1107, says, quote, "The Crusaders were so desperate with hunger, they ended up, a horrible thing to have to describe,
cutting up the bodies of the Turks, cooking them and eating them, end quote. That kind of 3-step dismemberment and cooking process, that very simple process, is kept the same throughout these early accounts. Roberts is the first one that describes it as a horrible thing that had to be done, which is interesting because he talks casually of other violence committed against the so-called Turks at that time. Gebert of Nogent, writing around 1108, gives a similar report, though now the tone, even though we're only talking about writing a year after that last account, is starting to change a little bit, though not in the way you might think. He writes, quote, "Some of our men, entirely without resources, cut pieces of flesh from Turkish corpses, cooked them, and ate them. But this was done rarely and in secret, so that no one could be sure whether they actually did this." End quote. So now we see from him that he thinks of this as more of a rumor than it may or may not have actually occurred. Now, about 100 years after all this, after the Crusaders took Jerusalem, Jerusalem would be taken back by Saladin, Sultan of Egypt. When this happened, more accounts of the original First Crusade started to be published in Europe as the church tried to build support for somehow retaking the city. And now when these other accounts of the First Crusade start getting written, and still remember we're only about 100 years after the fact, it's changed even again. Now there's a mysterious subgroup of the Christian Crusader army from that First Crusade, known as the Tafurs. These had partnered with the Christian Crusaders. These later accounts make it clear that the Tafurs didn't have enough food, but they also took great pleasure in what they were doing. There's even stories at this point of the Crusaders laughing with the Tafurs and sharing wine with them as they go about eating the bodies of the Turks. And now, obviously, different historians analyze all these different stories. And I will say that the Tafurs were real, and they were really intense, but we can talk about them another day. But I think the most interesting thing to me is, you know, we started out with a really clear, concise story, but now almost in real time we've watched the narrative shift. These same actually later accounts from 100 years after make it clear that these acts of cannibalism by their allies really frightened the Muslims and helped to win the siege. The Crusaders in this version are still kind of the good guys, while also engaging in fear tactics that could be viewed as, if somewhat barbaric, still necessary and helpful. And to be honest, we'll probably never know the exact extent or details of any cannibalism that may have occurred during the First Crusade. And I wanted to stop here today for a couple of reasons. One is that we can see here a really good example of a culture that's not accepting of cannibalism reacting to cannibalism. And like I said, almost in real time, almost as it's happening. And second, that sort of brings us nicely back to Herxheim and all the evidence we saw there, but just how easily, again, that could be taken completely different ways. And Herxheim could end up not being a site of exocannibalism. Maybe there wasn't any cannibalism of any kind either during the First Crusade. All we can do is interpret the evidence in front of us as best we can. And either way, I hope that this first chunk of our journey together has shown that even if Herxheim is an example of exocannibalism, like I think it probably is, then that doesn't mean it's necessarily this unusual factor in our history. It's an unfortunate one. It's a weird thing that seems to rear its ugly head in our collective consciousness from time to time. This idea that a person can look at another person and not see a person anymore, at least not in the same way. We're going to talk about that more in part 2. I'd like to end today on a quote from a Catholic Daic teacher who I think sums up what we've learned of exocannibalism so well. I didn't include in the main story, but it's a quote that's haunted me. In an interview with The Independent that's actually also incredibly moving, and you'll find it along with everything else today in my sources that I'll talk about in a second. This Daic teacher, on explaining the phenomenon going on there with exocannibalism and the tension between the Daic and the Madurese, he said, quote, "In the eyes of the Daics, when people do not respect our Adat, they become enemies, and we don't consider our enemies to be human anymore. They become animals in our eyes, and the Daics eat animals." End quote. And that in so many ways, it sums up so much about exocannibalism. But I want to stop here too and say again, like I did when I was talking about the people from Borneo earlier, this makes up a small part of the Daic history, and
please, I would hate for you to walk away thinking of them just as this one thing. They have such a beautiful past and a beautiful culture, as do all the people and their ancestors portrayed here today. By nature of the topic of this video, I am focusing on exocannibalism, and so using the deck again as an example, I am forced by the nature of this video to bring up this part of our history. But I would never want to portray everyday person as being comfortable with what I've described. Further, I don't want to be so protective of them that I don't also pay honor to the horrible suffering that the Madaris have gone through. Many of the survivors lost their whole families or good parts of them. Many suffered terrible injuries, and my heart broke reading about some of this suffering when making this episode. From the beginning, I've said that we're going to have to be able to hold two things as true at once. And I sort of had to live it when I was researching this. I'm so sorry for everything that's happened there, and for everyone in the past who's been hurt by this othering of others. But I hope I'm starting to show too, this is not just something that happens in Borneo. This is not something that just happens in ancient Britain. This is not something that just happens in ancient China or in the ancient Americas. And in our next episode, we are going to be hearing tales of cannibalistic revenge arcs from medieval Italy, as well as some cannibal tribes from the Congo Basin in Africa. We're going to be exploring more of the history of exocannibalism in Asia, and a whole bunch of other instances of exocannibalism from just all over the world. And guys, thank you so much for being here with me and joining me for part 1 of A Delicate History of Exocannibalism. I hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you for trusting me to share with you such a complex and sometimes painful topic. I'd also like to take this time to thank you for your compassion, your empathy, and your humanity. Because if you have an interest in our human history, then that means to me that you do have all these qualities, and I'm very happy that you do. And if you find yourself particularly interested in our topic today, then just like always, please don't let my words be the last words you hear on any topic, but especially on any of the amazing, wonderful cultures that you heard me talk about today. And just like always, you'll find a link to my source list pinned to the top comment below. But please don't stop there. And you know, your local library might have an awesome book on ancient Europe or ancient China or ancient Africa, any part of the ancient Americas, any of the ancient. It'd be wonderful. Oh, it'd be a wonderful time. We could go back further. You want a book on Neanderthals? You won't know until you go check is the thing. You'll just have a nice time either way. Just go to the library. You'll have so much fun. Just go to the library. And when you get back from the library, let me know how you made out. Before I end completely, I would like to say too, thank you to my subscribers for their patience this month. I've been teasing this episode for a while, but then some things came up, and now I know I'm going to be uploading it a few days late. This was just a combination of stuff that came up in my life, and to be honest, this was originally going to be one big, long episode covering the whole history of exocannibalism. But guys, we have so much just in the early modern/modern history to cover of exocannibalism. It felt so crushed together. Thank you for your patience. And part 2 will be this month's deep dive episode, so you won't have to wait long for the finish. And I'll let you know too, Lost Bits will be coming back like normal this week. I just took a little break on it so I could finish this up. I love you all so much, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon. But either way, thank you again so much for being here today. Be safe, be happy, go with all my love. Until next time, goodbye.